Thank you, Hilmi, and welcome everyone. My responsibility is to briefly introduce Professor Richard Falk. Richard is the Professor of International Law at Princeton University, Professor of Global Order and International Relations at the University of California at Santa Barbara. He's the author of at least 20 books and 20 co-authored reports, including that highly significant report about Israeli practices towards Palestinians, the question of apartheid, with Virginia Tilley. His books have covered topics such as humane governance, shifts in power, the new global order, the nature of human rights, and of course the recent Pluto Press book about a just peace for Palestine towards new horizons. In all of that work, if you follow 40, 50 years or more of Richard's work, and Hilmi's already hinted at that, he's been amazingly scrupulous, forensic in his attention to detail, always backed by evidence, always reaching for the highest academic standards. You will also know that he was appointed by Kofi Annan as the United Nations Special Rapporteur for the Occupied Territories between 2008 and 2014, a role in which he, with enormous courage, stuck with the principles of international law, not necessarily berating always the Israelis, but looking at those principles as the yardstick by which to judge what was fair and just. Nevertheless, he was never welcome. He was smeared. I wouldn't say criticized, because criticized presupposes some kind of capacity for reflection and fair judgment. And smearing and derision does not involve that. I mean, he's been detained, imprisoned, expelled from Israel, but nevertheless had maintained the high standards that had characterized all his work. He really meets two criteria that merited our inviting and persuading and being incredibly pleased that he's here this evening. The first criteria Hilmi's already talked about. It's about the characteristic Australian welcome to anybody who sticks up for the rights of the Palestinians, namely the article that appeared in the Australian Jewish News. It's almost a badge of honor, Richard, I'm sorry to say, that you got that kind of derision as a form of journalism. I'm fed up with derision as a form of journalism. It doesn't befit a so-called civil society. It's intellectually lazy. It's not worth even 1 out of 10 in a student's essay. And that brings me really to the last criterion by which to welcome Richard. It's a cliche that in lecture theatres, students will say about professors, do they walk the walk or just talk the talk? Well, the whole of Richard Falk's career is about walking the walk, and on those grounds, please welcome him to this setting.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Stuart, for those gracious words. I'm delighted to be here, and I appreciate the obstacles overcome to get me here, which were not something unique in my experience, but they represent a telling indication of why it's important to speak to these issues at this time. It's not accidental that the recourse to smearing has become the characteristic modus operandi of the Zionist militant groups. And in a way, it's a tribute to all of you who are activists here, because those that are trying to use this kind of tactics have given up on substance. They want to wound the messenger rather than address the message. And that's a very big development, in a way, suggesting that civil society is where this struggle is now being waged. And it's a very important aspect of the distinctiveness of this long Palestinian ordeal that really stretches over the course of more than a century at this point. Let me say just at the outset that today happens to be my favorite American holiday. It's the Independence Day, and what it celebrates is the inalienable rights of people to be treated equally and with suitable dignity. And so there's a certain, I've never had the opportunity to celebrate the 4th of July other than by watching fireworks. So to have this kind of, I suppose, verbal fireworks is a great advance in terms of really embodying the best of what America started out to be and understanding its relevance to the struggle of the Palestinian people, because really what is at stake is the denial of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people. And as long as that denial occurs, there will be this cycle of repression and resistance. It's inevitable in the 21st century, a post-colonial period in human history, where people are not prepared to be passive in the face of an attempt to impose another kind of society on a native people or on a resident population. And I've said for some time that the original sin of Zionism is to impose a Jewish state on an essentially non-Jewish society. And from that original sin flows almost all of the repressive tactics and the what has culminated in what we believe on the basis of an academic study to be to qualify as the crime of apartheid. And apartheid is an international crime with an international convention supporting it. But what I mean by the inevitability both of apartheid and of the cycle of violence is that in this period of history, the nationalism of a people is something that cannot be subdued by violence and military force. All of the anti-colonial struggles were won by the weaker side militarily. And one should ponder that, why that is so, why that became so and wasn't true prior to the middle of the last century. And my own understanding is that there was this surge of national self-determination that was given legitimacy by the United Nations, by international public opinion, and the combination of that renewed confidence in the right and destiny of a people to control their own future created a capacity to reverse the balance of forces that had been associated with the way change occurs in history and the role of military power and military superiority which underpinned the colonial era and accounted for the spread of European colonialism globally. So what I'm trying to express is that the end of the colonial era gave rise to what might be called the potency of soft power. And the potency of soft power is that this combination of nationalist self-assertion combined with global solidarity and added to by perseverance, managed to overcome military inferiority and the weakness that would be associated with an understanding of history and change as reflecting relative power in that traditional realist sense of military capabilities. And it's a lesson that the major governments, and especially my own, refuse to learn. They refuse to accept the limitations of military power in the 21st century. They should have learned the lesson in Vietnam, where the US had every kind of military superiority and yet lost the war. See, and that's the paradigm that I'm trying, the new historical paradigm that is the foundation of hope for the Palestinian struggle. It is that paradigm that would challenge what appears from the pre-World War II outlook to be a lost cause. It's a lost cause from this older perspective. And it's a lost cause in terms of the degree to which Israel has geopolitical support, has been able to neutralize the Arab governments that are its neighbors, and to some extent has even covertly aligned with them, especially in confronting Iran, and seems to be in total control of the situation. See, but again, that points to the failure to grasp this new paradigm. And that failure to grasp it is partly an underestimation of the cause that unites most of the people here in this room. The BDS campaign is an expression of global solidarity. And global solidarity combined with the right of resistance is what shifts over time the balance of forces. See, and and that's why perseverance is so important, because these struggles against superior military power involve great suffering for the society that is victimized. The Vietnamese lost 3 to 4 million people in achieving their victory. So because the old paradigm is able to destroy and kill almost without limitation, but it can't control the political outcome. That's the dirty secret of militarism. It can kill people and destroy cities and destroy society, but unless it's prepared to go to genocidal extremes, it can't win politically. And that's the importance of this moment. We're at I think in one of those critical junctures in the course of this long Palestinian ordeal. And it's a critical juncture for several reasons. The first of which is that Israel has recognized that the real battlefield now is the struggle for legitimacy. And the struggle for legitimacy, what I've called in the past a legitimacy war, has to do with the relative morality and legality of the two adversary positions that are at stake. And why Israel is taking such an effort to discredit peaceful attempts to achieve progressive change is because they understand that what is at stake is their legitimacy as a society in the world. And therefore they, in order to wage that battle, they can't wage it substantively because of international law is too much on the side of the Palestinians if you look at the evidence. I used to say, well, being a special rapporteur, that you only have to be 10% objective to come to the same conclusions that I came to. You don't need to be balanced. The reality is so clear. I mean, the unlawfulness of the settlements, the annexation of Jerusalem, the denial of the right of return to Palestinian refugees, all of these issues, if subjected to any kind of fair-minded assessment, would favor the Palestinian interpretation of the relevance of the legal norms. Therefore, they can't, Israelis can't argue the substantive case, and they realize that. And that's why there was no problem of this sort 10 years ago. There were problems, of course, but not of this sort, not an attempt to discredit those that were critical of the state of Israel. And in that sense, it shows that the Palestinians are winning the legitimacy war. And they're winning the legitimacy war precisely, and one sign of their winning it is this desperate effort to invalidate the BDS campaign, a nonviolent form of criticism of the policies of a sovereign state. When the BDS idea was launched in relation to South African apartheid, there were many opponents of it, including at my university. And there were people who said it doesn't work, or it helps, it'll do more harm to the Africans than to the Afrikaners, or that it is inconsistent with the strategic interests of the US and the UK in the Cold War. All of these arguments were made, but there was never the attempt to discredit those that supported BDS. There was always the sense that this is the right of people in a free society, and that you may disagree with that, the exercise of that right or the arguments that underlie it, but the essential truth of the position is that this is a way that people of conscience in a free society can act for what they believe in. And so it's really, it should be shocking that there's this attempt to use law in this distorted way to delegitimize this nonviolent form of solidarity with the Palestinian people. And this nonviolent form is essential to the struggle at the core of the legitimacy war. Because what it really is doing, and what it did in the connection with South Africa, was to lead in the first case, in the instance of South Africa, it led the South African elite to quietly recalculate their interests and decide for their own sake. They didn't have a sudden moral awakening, waking up one morning and saying, "Oh, this kind of racism is horrible. We have to become." We have to honor all people equally. They didn't do that. What they did was to say, we're better off with a constitutional democracy than being isolated in the world and suffering from the kind of delegitimation that was associated with the reliance on apartheid that was criminalized by the UN and which led to a grassroots campaign all over the world that is analogous to what is happening in relation to the Palestinian struggle. But so that what I think is important to recognize is that there have been many attempts, some sincere, mostly really contrived public relations kinds of efforts to solve the problems between the Palestinians and Israelis. And all of these past attempts were what I call politics from above. That is relying on governments or international institutions, not on people. See, and those attempts to solve the problem were, they started off with the partition effort after World War II, and the partition effort was one where suddenly a territory administered by the UK as a mandate, a unified territory, was to be divided between two peoples without ever consulting the wishes of the population living in the territory. See that, and that was a complete, the UN backed at that time a complete denial of the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people, of the Arab population that lived there. And you have to remember, and this is part of this original sin that I referred to, that when the Zionist movement was launched at the end of the 19th century, the Jewish population of Palestine was somewhat under 8%. And it led early Zionists to say, you don't have to be crazy to be a Zionist, but it helps. It helps because the undertaking was so unrealistic as a political project. It could be a dream, and it could be a fantasy, even a utopian sort of undertaking. But to think that you could get political traction to displace a resident population that was 92% was crazy. And when the Balfour Declaration was issued, the population had increased from 8% approximately to 8.1%. Again, not a recipe for creating a Jewish state in Palestine. And it should be remembered that what the British agreed to, it was a pure colonial initiative, but what they agreed to was not a Jewish state, but a Jewish homeland. They pledged support for a Jewish homeland. And my own sense is that if there is to be a kind of coexistence between these two people in a sustained peace, it would have to revert to some version of sharing the territory and having some kind of acknowledgement of dual homelands within the territory. But this is irrelevant to what I'm really trying to suggest. And what I'm trying to suggest is basically that these attempts, such as partition and the Oslo diplomacy, which really was an instrument for Israeli expansionism and really diminished Palestinian relative position, which already was disadvantaged by the outcome of the 1948 war, which converted the 55% that was given to Israel by the UN into 78%. And even, see, one of the things that people haven't understood about the Zionist project is that it always exceeds what it formally claimed. You know, it was first supposedly satisfied with the pledge of a homeland, and then it was committed to getting the British out of Palestine so it could establish a state. And then it accepted the partition, but it really didn't want the partition. It wanted to have as much of the biblical entitlement that it saw Israel as the promised land in relation to this biblical entitlement, which had nothing to do with international law. I mean, many ethnicities have a kind of entitlement based on historical connection. What is true and distinguishes the situation in Palestine from other settler colonial situations is that there is that emotional connection of Jews to this territory and to Jerusalem, and there has been a continuous Jewish population, even though it's a small minority, that has lived there. That isn't true of the other settler colonial experiences, and it creates a harder kind of sense of justification. It's a justification that is based on ideas that have no legal foundation except within the Israeli framing of the question, because the overriding legal norm that's relevant is this norm of self-determination and the self-determination of the people that are resident in the society. So what I believe is the current stage of the struggle is one in which the efforts by governments and the UN have clearly failed. They've failed because of a number of reasons. One reason is that Israel has the geopolitical backing of the US and to some extent Western Europe, and that allows it to avoid the kinds of political and moral pressures that have been exerted on it. The further reason is the sense of liberal guilt about the Holocaust that initially clouded the eyes of those that were victorious in World War II to the injustice being done to the Palestinian people. You can't justify the injustice to one people by transferring it to another people. So you can't reproduce injustice through this kind of liberal effort to overcome the guilt of not having helped the Jewish population during the rise of Hitler and the Nazi period. And so that historical grounding of the disregard of Palestinian basic rights is part of what allowed this original sin to eventuate in the establishment of a Jewish expanding state. And Israel has made clear time and time again that when it's offered a political compromise, it's not interested. The Arab Initiative of 2002 was a very forthcoming offer not only to create a political compromise within Palestine, but to ensure Israel that it would have normal relations with the Arab world. It was an opening that if Israel was interested in a political compromise, it would have gladly accepted, or at least explored. It never even explored that initiative. And so what I think is clear at this point is that these efforts to solve the problem from above, either from the intergovernmental diplomacy or by the UN, have failed. And that this means that the responsibility and opportunity to effect a just outcome in Palestine is situated more clearly than ever before in the people of the world, the peoples of the world. Because it's the outcome depends on the mobilization of civil society globally. And that's why BDS is so central, because it's a way has a proven history of having been effective in overcoming what appeared to be an impossible task. I was in South Africa not long before Nelson Mandela was released, and one of the things that was evident there on all sides of the conflict, I had the opportunity, because I was an official observer of a political trial, to talk to a wide spectrum of South Africans. And what they all agreed about was that the future would either be a bloody struggle or a permanent perpetuation of the apartheid regime. No one, literally no one, saw the possibility that the Afrikaner elite would change course. And as I said earlier, they changed course because they recalculated their interests and they believed correctly, I think, that they would be better off abandoning apartheid than perpetuating it and confronting indefinite resistance and opposition, which they would have to confront. So when you deny the spirit of equality, which is this idea of inalienable rights that I started with, you inevitably are pushed toward a violent form of repression. And that pushes the other side toward resistance, and the cycle continues. And the most you can hope for are ceasefires, not sustainable peace. And if you seek sustainable peace for these two peoples, it has to be based on the spirit of equality. And that's never been at the core of the international diplomacy, because the international diplomacy was always tilted toward security for Israel. And when you make that without talking about security for the Palestinians, what you're really doing, you're confronting what social scientists call the security dilemma. That is, by improving your security, you make others insecure. And that was the essence of all of these one-sided diplomatic efforts, that they focused on what were the conditions of achieving Israeli security in the event that a Palestinian state emerged. And what that entailed was this permanent subjugation and insecurity of the Palestinian people. So the necessity of a peace based on the spirit of equality, that will be the only way of achieving a sustained peace. And as Edward Said and other Palestinians have pointed out, that kind of sustainable peace needs to also have some kind of acceptance of the inevitability of historical change, that the imposition of the Jewish Zionist project may have been and was flawed from its outset, but you have a situation that has emerged where there needs to be some kind of accommodation between the two peoples in order to have a sustained peace. But that accommodation must be based on this idea of equality, not hierarchy. And all of the peace initiatives from above have been based on keeping the Israelis above the Palestinians and basically creating a situation of permanent subjugation. And our assessment of the apartheid structure was pertained to the whole of the Palestinian population, including the refugees, that the notion that Israel could only have its political dream of being a Jewish state and a democratic state by engaging from the outset in ethnic cleansing, to put it politely, I suppose. In other words, you could not have a democratic Israel without having the Nakba, the expulsion of up to 750,000 Palestinians, which gave a demographic majority to Israel. And the second, I said earlier that the first anxiety of Israel at the present time is losing the legitimacy war. But the second anxiety is the demographic bomb, the notion that Israel can't be a single victorious state in this struggle and keep its credential of being at least an electoral democracy. So that's been a puzzle. Let me bring these remarks to a close by referring briefly to the deal of the century, which I call the fraud of the century, but first of all, it doesn't aim to achieve an agreement, and that it aims at coercing Palestinian political surrender and offering in exchange for that surrender some kind of economic enhancement of Palestinian life. And it's surprising to me that in most of the discussion, it hasn't been properly observed that the Trump presidency has engaged in a series of steps that were not designed to create an atmosphere of accommodation, but were designed to convey to the Palestinians that they are supporting a lost cause and that they'd be better off giving up and having a somewhat better material life than they presently have. And that idea of being a lost cause was typified by moving the American embassy to Jerusalem, by cutting off the funding for UNRWA in the occupied territories, by justifying Netanyahu's moves toward annexing settlements as part of Israeli sovereign territory, and then culminating in the support for the annexation of the Golan Heights in Syria, that are Syrian territory, and a blatant violation of one of the cardinal principles of international law that emerged from World War II, namely that you can't acquire territory by the use of force. See, and a complete disregard of that. But the point I'm making about what preceded this recent Bahrain conference on the economic dimensions of the Trump initiative was a series of steps that were designed to convey something more than what previous American presidents had done. They had been partisan. There's no question. They were leaning toward the Israeli side, and as I said earlier, their emphasis on security for Israel only was decisive in making impossible demands of the Palestinians in the context of the so-called peace process and the Oslo diplomacy. So that this way of conceiving of the conflict was a very deep distortion that now is being played out as saying the diplomacy has failed. See, the partisanship of the past did not produce the one-sided outcome that the U.S. and Israel were seeking. So this is a way of shifting from partisanship to partnership in the promotion of an Israeli outcome that is not a diplomatic compromise, but is a political victory. See, and that's the and the thinking for this comes from Zionist think tank, the Middle East Forum. Daniel Pipes, whose name you may know, had this idea of the victory caucus. And he basically said, diplomacy has been tried, it's failed, we have to do something else, and the something else is that wars end when one side wins and the other side loses. So we have to make the Palestinians understand that they've lost. And to make them understand that they've lost, we have to put more coercion, make them more miserable, create a situation of sufficient political desperation that they will surrender. And that's really the Kushner-Trump approach to quote-unquote peace and prosperity. And of course, it involves, it's sort of an Orwellian twist on these fine words. So let me end by saying that I think there is hope for a just solution. And that hope comes from the way other struggles of this sort have eventually ended. And it depends on the continued perseverance of the Palestinian people, which has been manifest in the Great March of Return, this quite extraordinary nonviolent effort to express Palestinian grievances over the past more than a year now, on successive Fridays. That expression of robust resistance, combined with this growing global solidarity movement, as epitomized by the BDS campaign, is what I regard as the path to Palestinian victory in this long struggle. Thank you very much.